For nearly 20 years, every summer, when the heat of the Provençal sun made his work impossible, the artist and printmaker Leo Marchutz would grain his stones. By rubbing the heavy slabs of limestone against each other, he would erase his yearly production in preparation for his future drawings to be made. For most, this process is monotonous, physically exhausting and mentally draining. But for Marchutz, it meant peace. The rhythmic sound of the stones freed his mind from his art, which consumed his life and was so intrinsically linked with his traumatic personal history and with Europe's darkest hour.
Leo Marchutz, c'est un personnage hors norme. Hors norme dans le monde cézannien, hors norme dans le monde de la création picturale, hors norme dans sa vie. Et c'est ça qui en fait, si je puis dire, le sel, qui en fait l'intérêt et qui lui donne une présence et une contemporanéité toujours vivante.
Someone were to ask me, okay, who was Leo Marchutz? I say he's one of the most important undiscovered artists of the 20th century. I mean, it's this extraordinary story of, someone of incredible depth and accomplishment who's gone completely ignored. He had to be in hiding from the Nazis during World War II. He bridged, the world of German philosophy and German thought and the world of Cezanne. He was one of the foremost scholars of Cezanne in the world, but in this very low-key, invisible way.
Leo Marchutz arrived in the town of Aix-en-Provence in 1928, eager to discover the motifs of French painter Paul Cezanne. 10 years prior, in his native Germany, he had been transformed by the sight of these oil paintings, by the one who would later be considered to be the father of modern art. This first trip to Provence enabled him to see his mentor's recurring motifs: the countryside, the Mount Sainte-Victoire, and Châteaunoir, where Cezanne had his studio for 16 years. There, Marchutz befriended the owner, who offered to rent him a room, and after a series of short trips, he settled there permanently in 1931. Born into a wealthy Jewish family in Nuremberg in August of 1903, Marchutz had shown great interest in art from an early age. He had been deeply moved by the medieval works of sacred art, which abounded in his hometown. And when he began drawing and painting at the age of 13, despite his family's Jewish heritage, his first works of art were of biblical figures from the New Testament. But ever since his discovery of Cezanne, his works had shifted away from sacred art, and nature had become his main source of inspiration. Soon after he moved to Châteaunoir, a small community of German artists formed and decided to work the land in order to become self-sufficient. Together, they planted a vegetable garden, raised chickens, and painted. Leo's days before the war were divided between Cezanne research, painting, feeding the chickens, and pulling weeds. Lunches and dinners were times of passionate debates on art, philosophy, and poetry. But this studious and bucolic lifestyle came abruptly to an end when France declared war on Germany in August of 1939.
Encore sous la Troisième République, quand il y a eu la déclaration de guerre, c'est-à-dire le 3 septembre 1939, il y a eu tout de suite un décret, quelques jours après, en disant « Tous les Allemands, tous les Autrichiens sont nos ennemis ». Tous les historiens aujourd'hui disent que c'était une idiotie notable parce que tous les Autrichiens ou Allemands qui venaient en France, c'était des anti-nazis. Il y avait des communistes, il y avait des socialistes, il y avait des homosexuels. Enfin, toutes les populations qui étaient poursuivies en Allemagne venaient en France en se disant là, on n'aura pas de problème.
As a German citizen, Marchutz was considered a threat to the French nation and placed in a detention camp in the nearby village of Les Milles. For over 5 months he was incarcerated, along with 1,500 other inmates in this brick factory, which had been converted into a makeshift prison. The living conditions in this camp were dire. The inmates spent most of their time in the old brick ovens and had little access to natural light. Their sleeping quarters were none other than giant halls, where they were forced to sleep on the floor and had very little to protect themselves from the freezing weather conditions of the winter of 1939. A few years later, in 1942, under the German occupation, the Vichy government would convert this prison into a deportation camp for Auschwitz. Thousands of Jewish men, women, and children were sent to their deaths from Les Milles. Marchutz avoided this thanks to his wife Barbara, who, with the help of friends in Paris, had managed to obtain his temporary release, under the condition that he would serve in the French army.
Donc il a été envoyé pour rejoindre l'armée française qui était inexistante, parce qu'entre-temps, les Allemands arrivaient, ils avaient occupé la Hollande et la Belgique, et ils arrivaient, ils ont occupé Paris, et le gouvernement a été obligé de fuir, donc il est parti à Bordeaux, et l'armée, c'était la débandade totale. Donc il a eu la chance qu'on lui dise, bon ben écoutez, vous avez votre fille qui vient de naître et vous avez votre poulailler, qui était considéré d'intérêt général, donc ils lui ont dit on vous libère, et là à partir de là il s'est planqué.
With the risk of famine ever growing, the small chicken farm that Marchutz and his friends had established was seen as an asset, and Marchutz was relieved of his military duties to tend to his chickens in order to help feed the French population. But upon his return to Châteaunoir, sensing imminent danger, he decided to hide.
Leo, being Jewish, had to hide in the caves of Bibi Moose during the German occupation, and his wife Barbara raised chickens in the chicken coops.
Le poulailler était sur un champ. Donc il disait, je dormais dans le poulailler parce que si la voiture arrivait par là, je partais comme ça, et si elle arrivait par là, je partais comme ça. Et au-dessus de Châteaunoir, il y a des grottes, et donc là, il dormait dans les grottes. Ça a duré 4 ans quand même, 4 ans.
Leo Marchutz vit en ermite, caché à Châteaunoir, et dans cette solitude, il va réaliser une foule de dessins faits sur du papier, comme on dit, boucherie. C'est du papier que lui rapportait son épouse, qui apportait les poulets qu'ils élevaient dans les boucheries.
C'est fabuleux. Pensez que cet homme, reconnu comme éleveur de poules, il se fait livrer du papier de boucher et dessus, il dessine l'évangile de Saint-Luc.
Comment dire, il était pas religieux, je veux dire, il n'a jamais pratiqué de religion. Il n'allait pas à l'église, tu sais, pour la messe, pour tout ça. Il était même anti tout système, mais par contre, il était, disons, spiritualiste. Il pensait qu'il y avait certaines choses qui ne sont pas forcément matérielles, qui existent au-delà, si tu veux, du matériel.
Il n'est pas chrétien au sens pratiquer une religion chrétienne. Que fait cet homme qui, sur du papier de boucherie, dessine des personnages de Saint-Luc qu'il transformera, grâce à la lithographie, dans ce merveilleux livre qui est le Saint-Luc que nous connaissons et qui est peut-être un des sommets de son art.
The power in his work is that it didn't just come from a reading of Saint Luke, but it came from what he had lived. The rejection, the solitude, the hopelessness, even possible imminent death. All of those things were deep inside him. He saw a vision in St. Luke that was akin to his own vision.
D'abord, il a commencé à dire qu'est-ce que je pourrais faire de tous ces dessins. Ces dessins sont très légers. Et la critique que, juste après la guerre, lui feront tous ses amis, c'est tes dessins sont beaux, mais on n'y voit rien.
I've got some in the bedroom in there. I've got a beautiful Christ in there that I'll show you. You can barely see it. And there's some drawings there you can barely see them because they're done on such cheap paper.
Il était en relation avec un certain nombre d'artistes qui étaient dans le coin, et ses amis lui ont dit « Écoute, ces dessins sont formidables, il faut absolument que tu en fasses un album avec ça. »
Il est venu à la lithographie comme moyen de gravure pour faire un livre qui s'appelle Le Saint-Luc.
Donc il a construit un atelier, il a acheté une presse lithographique, il a acheté une presse typographique, et il s'est mis au boulot avec notre mère qui a d'ailleurs étudié la typographie. J'ai encore des bouquins là.
Barbara learned to typeset. You have this little apparatus, it's a beautiful thing to watch, typeset with each letter, and you have these cases. Like on a typewriter, you have the keys and what have you. Well, in the cases, you had the letters, and you'd pick out an A, L, and you'd compose across here like this, and then you'd have to space the thing visually, and you'd pull proofs of that. So she did the text, and Leo did the drawings of that, and this took 3 years.
À eux deux, ils ont fait tout le travail de l'Évangile qui est apparu en 1949.
Ces dessins qui étaient très spontanés, qui étaient faits entièrement d'imagination, dans le recueillement, dans le confinement d'un événement tragique qui était la guerre, ces dessins, il les voit revivre avec la lithographie. La transformation de ces dessins en dessins lithographiques a fait que le trait était déjà plus épais. Et que, étant plus épais, il était plus visible.
The drawings of the St. Luke were done on the stone. And that's amazing because if your drawing doesn't work perfectly, you've got to regrain the stone. Lithography is simply based on the fact that water and grease do not mix. The lithographic drawing is done with either a lithocrayon or a liquid grease ink.
It's a chemical process. So you etch the stone by putting a mixture of drops of nitric acid into gum arabic and putting that solution over the drawing. What it does is it makes permanent the grease strokes and it opens the pores of the rock to receive the water. And then you roll your ink out on your palettes. And you roll it onto the stone that's been humidified by the sponge. The ink only sticks to the drawing strokes on the stone. Then you put your humidified paper onto the stone, and then you run it through the press.
The beauty of working in those presses, the lever that you stood on, and you could feel the pressure in that beautiful ship's wheel that you pulled it. And just the feel of going through at the speed you want to go through it. You want to go through very slowly, but you can't stop anywhere. If you stop anywhere, it makes for an uneven transfer. So keeping that pressure, keeping that moving with that beautiful wheel and that lovely leather strop that's pulling it through. Those are beautiful.
It releases the ink onto the paper in a way and in a manner that's almost identical to the drawing.
Dans la lithographie, l'image est une image à l'envers. C'est-à-dire, on grave, on encre et on restitue. Ce qu'on restitue, c'est à l'envers.
Your image will always be mirrored when you print it. So it's not a problem when you're drawing biblical figures, but when he evolved in his subject matter and wanted to draw landmark places that we all recognize in the streets of Aix, for example, he couldn't draw directly on the stone and then print from that because everything would be mirrored and it would all be backwards.
À ce sujet, il mettra en application l'usage du papier report.
He had a special drawing book, and he would draw on that with these grease crayons, and you make a transfer, you're reversing it on the stone, and then when it's printed, it's reversed back to its recto, it's not verso.
That way, when he went to print, then it came out how he had actually drawn it. The other thing is it would be not very practical to take out 15 stones out to draw on.
Il était incapable de dessiner s'il y avait quelqu'un à côté de lui. Donc c'est une forme de timidité, appelle ça comme tu veux. Donc il dit, pour moi c'était impossible de prendre un chevalet, une toile, et de me mettre dans une ville et de peindre. Moi je ne l'ai jamais vu dessiner, pour te dire la vérité. Pourtant on était avec lui en Italie, on était souvent évidemment avec lui. Par contre, ce qu'on savait, c'est que quand il arrivait le soir, il avait je ne sais pas combien de dessins, et que la moitié il les foutait à la poubelle. Donc, il devait dessiner très très vite, et après le soir, il voyait ce qui était mauvais.
Spontaneity was absolutely important, yeah, to his way of working and what he developed in terms of the lithography, yeah.
Le transfert, donc le graphisme qui passe du papier sur la pierre, permet de faire des esquisses très rapidement, et ensuite, dans un deuxième temps, c'est une seconde création. Le fait de colorier un graphisme.
So that whole technique, if you want, grew out of Leo's way of drawing because it corresponded to his needs. To the best of my knowledge, that was just trial and error. And then he began to come up with things that worked like that and this whole technique. And so he could travel to Venice and come back. If he would stay for 10 days or 2 weeks, something, at the end of the trip, we're still fresh enough, we'd transfer. 10 days was pretty much the limit. A drawing over 10 days old, the grease had dried up and you couldn't transfer it.
Donc à partir du moment où il maîtrisait la lithographie en noir et blanc, il était en relation avec ces artistes qui étaient dans le coin. Ils ont dit, ah ben nous, ça l'intéresse. Et il a fait des albums. Il a fait un album pour Pierre Talquat. Il a fait 4 albums pour Masson. Et c'est en travaillant avec Masson qu'il s'est dit, il faut absolument que je puisse faire de la lithographie en couleur.
Color lithography, essentially, commercially, was done with 1 stone per color. And any technical book you read on it is going to tell you how you have stone for your blues and a stone for your reds and how you get the registries to line up. And Leo, to our knowledge, was the first person to actually start inking areas, but his drawings lent themselves to that.
Leo got the idea of making small rollers and putting it on a single stone. So these things this is totally Leo's invention. He had a beautiful, beautiful big old worn stone that was his palette. So the palette was on top there, which was right next to his press. Pull a couple of proofs in black and then come in with, a bluish gray here and then maybe he'd take another little roller and he'd maybe a little bit of, and he could get it in there. And the interesting thing to me is how much of that conditioned the fact that his strokes become more and more separate as he continues to work in lithography. Anybody that's been close to Leo understands that it's an inside job and it grows out of the particular needs. Everything, the evolution of what Leo did in lithography wasn't things he learned anywhere, were things that just came out of what he needed to express himself and to get out what was in him as an artist and as a human being.
La lithographie a été le chemin qu'a emprunté Marchutz pour trouver une écriture en face de la nature qui était la sienne.
The first big body of work that I've had contact with was strongly influenced by Cezanne in terms of the themes, right? He painted Saint-Victoire and, landscapes in Aix and still lifes and so on. He's still kind of under the influence of the master, but there's some kind of breakthrough that occurs between when he had to go into hiding and the end of the war, where all of that sort of gets abandoned and he's gone into this deep place through the drawings.
Un de ses thèmes favoris, c'était la Sainte-Victoire, que Cézanne a peint comme chacun sait. Et Lionel Venturi, qui était quand même un des grands critiques de l'époque, quand il a vu les lithographies en couleur qu'il a fait de la Sainte-Victoire, il a écrit « Vous êtes démarqué de Cézanne et vous avez fait une Sainte-Victoire qui est votre Sainte-Victoire ». Et c'est vrai que ça c'est indéniable.
Marchutz a une montagne émergente, vibratoire, musicale, ondoyante, évanescente. Quelquefois, elle est très proche de disparaître, si je puis dire. Il faut la prendre au moment où elle émerge avant qu'elle disparaisse. Et cette Sainte-Victoire de Marchutz, certes, elle fait mémoire de celle de Cézanne, mais en même temps, il l'oublie, il la dépasse, il la transforme, il la métamorphose. Et les Saintes-Victoires de Leo Marchutz sont uniques. Je veux dire, on les reconnaît entre mille. C'est rare quand même dans une vie d'artiste d'avoir l'humilité de se dire « je n'ai pas à être reconnu internationalement ». Et en même temps, j'ai un sillon à tracer, j'ai un regard à porter. Parce que faire une œuvre qui n'est pratiquement à la fin de sa vie que sur papier, c'est la reconnaissance que l'œuvre est une chose aussi sur des supports fragiles et que l'art est une chose fragile. Et Marchutz y traduit la fragilité.
It's not ego-driven work. It's quiet and deep and beautiful. Right? But he never achieved anything like commercial success in the world. I think on top of the years spent in hiding during the war, that must have been really painful, right? To have been driven by the war into this kind of deep self-examination, to bring something extraordinary back out into the world and have it more or less rejected is, it's hard for me to even imagine what that was like. I think that pretty much every artist struggles with this, is there value in what I'm doing? Naturally, I think it was a struggle for him to keep faith with what he was doing. I think he suffered from depression later in life because of it, and yet he did keep faith because some part of him knew that he was on the right track, and he knew he was having on those who could actually receive what he was giving, right? He was having a huge impact. That's still sitting, that whole legacy, that he's bequeathed to the human species, right, to all of us, it's still sitting there waiting to be discovered.